So related to, I guess, my first fermentations was this one of my first explorations of interference patterns of the Archimedes spiral. Even though I don't know if I have the words right, but I mirrored or I anti-symmetried the Archimedes spiral in my initial drawing. I don't know if bifurcated is the right word or not, but when I mirrored it in my initial drawing, I screwed up, and in one of the spirals, I don't know how else to say it except for that I created not a right triangle, and you can see in this spiral, it hugs closer than this spiral. Or maybe it's the other way around. But one of these spirals is tighter because in one of these circles, I didn't make a right angle where I should have. The curious thing about that is, what was my subconscious or the superconscious trying to say at that moment when I did that? So even though I did something wrong compared to what? And what was like the ultimate rightness trying to say? Where does what I assume to be right and what I assume to be wrong somewhere meet in the altogether rightness? But anyway, this was one of the first things I made back in the change from 2013 to 2014. And that was a different time. Before certain truth came to be known, but at a time when a certain truth came to be known. So it's important to me, and I'd like to remember it, and it's connected to the other things in my life, such as the fermentations I was exploring, the relationships I was exploring, and what at that time I found to be tasteful. Since then, I may have found to be distasteful. However, it may be as these fibers unite and then don't, so these ideas unite and then don't. And it's important. It's important in its own way. My imagination runs off in a lot of directions, and it exceeds my imagination, as retracted and small as it is, exceeds my reason. But somewhere between the smallness of my imagination and its excess, somewhere in there, somewhere in that domain, my reason meets it. And in some way that's where I hope to find myself. And for some reason, shapes in large part have become the way in which I symbolically relate to the world, and where my shapes, as in the shapes I've come to, make sense, the world makes sense, and where they don't, my world does not. And as an act of journaling, it's worthwhile that, presuming I have a future, from that future I may look back upon these things and hope to make sense of them. Thank you. So this is this was one of my or the result of one of my first quote unquote fermentations. I don't know a lot about fermentation. It has such a rich history, and there's so many different things They fall under the umbrella of the term fermentation. For me, it pretty much means putting things in water and see what happens. Don't put a cover on and leave it exposed to oxygen. Put a cover on, deprive it of oxygen, or put some kind of filter on and give it like a semi-deprivation, semi-exposed, semi-exposition to oxygen. And I like that idea because, well, it seems as though in fermentation, so much of the focus is on like lacto-fermentation, which basically put anything closed off with salt. Put anything in water, in a saline solution, deprived of oxygen, and you'll get a lacto-fermentation. Pretty much anything, is my understanding. But as beneficial as that can be, or as good as that can make us feel, the whole lactose, cheese, milk, lactic acid, deprived of oxygen. Like the whole Krebs cycle thing, which I don't understand at all, like everything else. But, deprived of oxygen. Deprived of oxygen, our muscles make lactic acid. Deprived of oxygen in a saline solution, fermentations are essentially a lacto-fermentation, which I guess in its own way, there are probably a zillion different types of lacto, whatever that is. Different species of whatever, bacteria, yada yada. But then with oxygenated fermentations, alcohol, I guess being among one of them, or vinegar, and I guess there would be a billion types of those. In yeasts, they sell a few different types of yeasts, right? I mean, if you go online or if you go wherever to buy a yeast for bread, a yeast for beer, a yeast for kombucha, a yeast for this and that, it would barely touch the amounts of yeasts that are out there. And then as far as the different types of yeasts, yeast seems to have some sort of connection to, forgive my symbolic, I'm using a lot of artistic license in my symbolism here, but yeast seems to be attached to the idea of Yeshua. And I'm not a proper Christian or a proper anything, really. But I try to keep my ear to the ground where I can, even though my head's in the clouds. But yeasts, in some sense, seem to be where it's at. And then there's, bacteria, the lacto, the yeast. So there's like the oxygen, the carbon dioxide, and the whole idea of carbon being the essential element of life, or like carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen. I've heard it said by one and more than ones, way smarter than me, that we're trying to get rid of the carbon, or that the carbon's 7, or that we're trying to have 2 nitrogens, an oxygen, a hydrogen, or that the carbon's 7, the carbon 14, and this all goes down to like sphere packing, and like there's like the Star of David, but then there's like the tetrahedral form of that, which wouldn't be the Star of David, and then there'd be tetrahedron or squares come down that aren't that are balanced at the half instead of at the center. That's something different. But anyway, this was one of my first adventures in fermentation. Wild carrot. And there's a couple different types. There's the Native American type without the red eye center, and there's the red eye centered European version. Both white, both not orange, both biennials. And it was mixed in this case with milkweed flower nectar, and it's kind of in a zombie state right now. It lived for a while. I had one version of this, which was the most beautiful. It was pinkish. It had a developed SCOBY, which was enormous. It was an enormous SCOBY, and it was very alive. And it seemed, this was the important part about the whole Krebs cycle thing, is that it seemed to, in some way, affect the Krebs cycle. It turned like, I think you can tell a lot from the smell of your feet. And it seemed to manipulate the cheesy aspect of foot cheese into a very beautiful lilac. A very beautiful honey lilac smell, which is also I think a symptom of diabetes, but maybe diabetes isn't really known either. But the most important thing was that when I reached exhaustion, it seemed as though, and this could be just an imagination, but it seemed as though when I went into a non-oxygenated state of muscle exertion, it seemed to bypass a lactic phase. There was no muscle ache the next day. I felt all right, which once again brings me into suspicion of the lactic aspect of the Krebs cycle. Anyway, I just thought this was worth noting. More to come, maybe.